If I asked you the question, how many dialects does China have? How would you answer? You probably know about Mandarin and Cantonese, and there's probably something different around Shanghai. So, 3? In fact, there are over 300 different dialects in the Chinese language, depending on how you break them down. This is a map of the biggest dialect groups in China. You might have noticed something right off the bat. There's one dialect group that takes up more than 2/3 of the entire country, Mandarin. We see it in the northeastern, central, southwestern, and northwestern parts of China. And here is where things start looking like a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. One of the questions I see pop up again and again is, why is the northern and even southwestern parts of China so unified in speaking one dialect when the southeast of China has so many different dialect groups? There are a few ways to look at this. First, let's look at the geographical differences between the north and the south. This eastern quarter of China is where over 94% of Chinese people live. But why do such an overwhelming majority of Chinese people live in this area? If we look at an extreme topographical map, I think it'll be clear to see right away. The right side of the country looks slightly more habitable. As you can see from the map, the northern region is mostly treeless, consisting of plains and plateaus. There is a big river called the Yellow River that runs from the Western Highlands eastward into the Yellow Sea. It's called the Yellow River because it starts in a dry and dusty highland called Huangtu Gaoyuan, which literally means yellow dirt highland. The downstream part of the river, a much more habitable environment, is the ancestral birthplace of Chinese people, called the Central Plains or Zhongyuan. Other than the difference in elevation on the western side, the north as a whole is dry and flat. The south, on the other hand, gets its winds from the South China Sea, which brings in seasonal monsoons, making the area quite wet and humid. The region as a whole is filled with river valleys, steep vegetation, and rice fields. The frequent hills and valleys of the south, interspersed by waterways, creates a unique topography that drastically contrasts the flat, dry topography of the north. Believe it or not, these climate and topographical differences have led to huge differences in how people spoke within the last 2,000 years. There is an old saying from the Tang era, 南船北马, or travel the south by boat, travel the north on horseback. Remember, the north is dry and flat, which makes it easy for traversion on horseback. Due to this, there was much more freedom of movement, and people could easily travel to other areas within this dry and flat region, allowing for the language to spread. This created more linguistic cohesion in the area. In the south, a region with high terraced rice fields and dense vegetation, horses stood no chance. Boats were the best bet for transportation, but they were usually used for cargo and less convenient for personal transportation. Can you imagine having to captain a boat every time you wanted to go get some groceries? Due to this, many people in the South simply stayed put in their own little farming villages, rather than frequently traversing to neighboring villages even. We can see that the greater transportation barriers led to greater differences in speech. For example, Guangzhou is the capital and commercial center of Guangdong province, and also serves surrounding provinces. Lying directly upstream of Guangzhou on the Xi River, Wuzhou is a city located in Guangxi province, about 269 kilometers away. In contrast, a city much closer to Guangdong, Taishan, is 129 kilometers away, but several rivers have to be crossed to get there. Despite being over twice as far from Guangzhou as Taishan, Wuzhou's speech is actually much closer to Guangzhou's. Guangzhou Cantonese speakers infamously have difficulty understanding Taishan speakers, whereas they usually report no problems with the Wuzhou dialect. The impact of geography on language diversification extends far beyond China. Papua New Guinea, home to over 800 languages, sits just north of Australia in the southwestern Pacific. Its rugged mountains, swamps, and dense forests created natural barriers that isolated communities, allowing hundreds of mutually unintelligible languages to emerge. However, is this geographical/topographical effect the only reason explaining southeastern China's wildly different language landscape? The differences in speech can also be explained by a bigger underlying reason. But to do that, we have to go back about 2,200 years, back to the Qin dynasty. Like I mentioned earlier, the Chinese people mainly lived in the north, in the Central Plains area at the basin of the Yellow River. There's another river below this area called the Yangtze in English and Changjiang in Chinese. Changjiang means long river, and it lives up to its name. It's the third largest river in the world at 6,300 kilometers or 3,917 miles long. Believe it or not, I actually memorized this when I was in high school quiz bowl. I was a real nerd. South of the Yangtze River, there were inhabitants, but at that time, these people were mostly not Han Chinese. They consisted of many different groups of people, which the Chinese collectively called Bai Yue. It's hard to determine exactly what languages they spoke, but linguists believe they included a mix of Tai Kadai, Hmong Mian, and Austroasiatic languages. In 221 BC, Qin Shi Huang, or the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, conquered this entire southern area and ordered up to 500,000 soldiers, convicts, and farmers to settle in the region and secure the borders. At this time, the south was essentially a frontier for China. It was a place with abundant resources, and it was easy to integrate, a highly economical choice. Because integration was gradual, northern settlers and the southern Baiyue populations lived side by side, and over time, many Baiyue communities adopted the Chinese language and customs. Back to the north. Beyond the Central Plains stretched the open steppe, vast grasslands home to nomadic peoples, who mainly spoke Mongolic and Tungusic languages. During periods of internal conflict, these groups, often labeled in Chinese sources as the Northern Barbarians or Beidi, would push southward into the homeland. Quite often, when Chinese in the north were defeated, they fled to the south for safety. After the fall of the Western Qin in the 4th century, and again after the Jurchen capture of the northern Song in 1127, millions of northern refugees crossed the Yangtze and settled in regions like Jiangnan and modern-day Guangzhou and Fujian. By the Song dynasty, the South had become a central pillar of Chinese civilization. It was an economic powerhouse that became a key bastion of support for the political center in the north. And precisely because governmental control was weaker in the South, local communities had more freedom to develop their own ways of speaking, which gradually grew even further apart over time. Additionally, because migration happened in waves, the resulting dialects were often varied and patchy. The earlier settled areas, the Jiangnan area around Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Jiangxi, and Hubei, show a lot more similarities to Mandarin compared to true southern areas like Fujian, Guangdong, and Guangxi. Even now, traces of earlier local languages remain. Dialects south of the Yangtze generally have more tones, with tonal complexity increasing the more south you go, a feature some linguists attribute to influence from highly tonal Baiyue and Tai languages. Similar influence may also be seen in the final stop consonants PTK, preserved in the deep south varieties like Cantonese, Min, and Hakka. Although the Baiyue languages themselves are no longer around, they're often linked to the ancestors of modern Tai Kadai languages spoken today across southern China and Southeast Asia. There are morphological clues too. In Mandarin, a modifier usually comes before the noun. For example, rooster is gong ji, literally male plus chicken. In Cantonese, the order is reversed. Gai gong, literally chicken plus male. Linguists have noticed that this noun plus modifier order is the same as that of Tai languages. These patterns are often described as substrate effects, where features of earlier local languages influence the speech of incoming populations. As northern migrants moved south, their varieties of Chinese mixed with indigenous languages, shaping how those southern dialects developed over time. Okay, I know what you're thinking. The Southern Chinese dialects are influenced by indigenous Southern languages. But what about Northern Chinese dialects? I mentioned that northern invaders, many of whom spoke Tungusic and Mongolic languages, lived among the northern Chinese for thousands of years. So Mandarin should be heavily influenced by those languages, right? Well, not quite. Some features of Mandarin, such as fewer tones, the loss of final stops, and retroflex consonants, align with northern languages like Tungusic and Mongolic, leading early scholars to argue that Mandarin was heavily shaped by those groups. However, more recent research suggests that many of these traits developed independently within the Chinese language itself. Thus, Tungusic and Mongolic influence on Mandarin is now viewed to have affected primarily vocabulary more than more intrinsic features like phonology, morphology, or syntax. And now the final mystery. What happened to the southwest? The whole area with Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, they're in the south too, but they pretty much all speak Mandarin. So what happened there? Well, here's where geography and migration patterns come into play once again. Southwest China is mostly mountains and highlands, which made it hard for large-scale settlement. The Han, Tang, and Song governments all tried to encourage settlers from the northern and central plains to move in, but success was limited. And then a devastating epidemic in the 13th century wiped out much of the population that was there. Centuries later, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, northern migrants were finally resettled into these highlands, bringing the Mandarin dialects with them. Over time, the area became predominantly Mandarin-speaking, thanks to both geography and migration patterns. Lastly, some of you might be wondering, many of these so-called Chinese dialects aren't mutually intelligible. Sometimes people in neighboring villages can barely understand each other. So why am I calling them dialects instead of languages? Well, mutual intelligibility is just one factor in determining. For example, Norwegian and Danish speakers often can understand each other, but those are still considered separate languages. Another factor is a standardized official writing system, one that's recognized and widely used. And having a standardized writing system is what kept China linguistically unified for thousands of years, even as spoken dialects started to vary greatly. And many people feel that the varieties of speech are as disparate as the different Romance languages in Europe. So you'll find people who call them different languages instead of dialects. But in actuality, both dialect and language are not quite accurate descriptions, as the Chinese phrase for these different varieties is called fangyan, literally place, language. There's actually a much more apt translation, topolict, combining the Greek topos, meaning place, and lect from Greek's lektos, meaning speech. This term was popularized by sinologist Victor Mayer in 1991, but I haven't seen it used much outside of linguistic circles, so maybe we can popularize it. I know he sometimes watches these videos, so if you're there, hi Dr. Mayer. This is part one of a two-part series, or maybe more if you guys are interested. Part 2 will explain all the different dialects in China, all 7 major groups, plus what some linguists view as 3 additional separate groups, looking at the phonological, morphological, and syntactic characteristics of each. And just as a teaser, Mandarin isn't as homogeneous as people think it is. Given the wide land area it covers, it naturally has huge variation, so I'll be covering this as well. So please look forward to that. And thank you for watching and see you next time.